November 3, 1977. 11 minutes into The Tonight Show, a woman in the fourth row collapsed during Johnny Carson's monologue. The audience gasped. Cameras kept rolling. NBC executives screamed to cut to commercial. But Carson did something no host had ever done. He stopped the show, jumped off the stage into the audience, and what happened in the next 7 minutes made 20 million viewers realize they'd never really known Johnny Carson at all. The Tonight Show on November 3, 1977 was supposed to be unremarkable. The guest list was solid, but not spectacular. Angie Dickinson promoting her new film, comedian George Carlin working out fresh material, and a musical performance by Helen Reddy. Johnny Carson's monologue was running smoothly, hitting all the right beats with jokes about President Carter's energy policy and the new Star Wars craze that had America standing in lines around the block. The studio audience of 300 was responsive, laughing in all the right places, creating that perfect rhythm that made The Tonight Show the most watched program in late-night television. Ed McMahon sat in his announcer chair, delivering his trademark laugh on cue. Doc Severinsen and the NBC orchestra provided the musical punctuation. Everything was working exactly as it had worked for 15 years, 5 nights a week, creating the illusion of effortless entertainment that millions of Americans relied on to end their day. Then, at exactly 11:41 p.m. Pacific Time, that illusion shattered in the most human way possible. Before we go any further into what happened that night, I need you to understand something about the world we're exploring here. The stories you're about to hear aren't the polished myths that get told in celebrity biographies or official television histories. These are the moments when the mask slipped, when the professional gave way to the person, when Johnny Carson stopped being America's favorite comedian and became something more complicated and more real. If you want to see behind the curtain of television's golden age, if you're ready to discover who these legends actually were when the cameras were supposed to cut away but didn't, then subscribe to this channel. Because what happened in those 7 minutes on November 3, 1977 is just the beginning of a much deeper truth about Johnny Carson and the cost of being America's most trusted face. The woman's name was Dorothy Chen, 42 years old, a librarian from Pasadena who had won her tickets to The Tonight Show through a radio contest 3 weeks earlier. She'd been looking forward to this night for months, had told everyone at work about it, had carefully chosen her outfit, a blue dress that she hoped might catch the camera if they did one of those audience reaction shots that occasionally made it into the broadcast. Dorothy had arrived at NBC's Burbank studios at 4 in the afternoon for the 5:30 taping, gone through the standard security checks, received her seat assignment in Section B, Row 4, Seat 11. She'd watched the warm-up comedian do his routine, laughed politely at jokes she'd heard before, and when Johnny Carson walked through that rainbow curtain at exactly 5:30 p.m. for what the studio audience believed was a live show, though it would actually air 6 hours later at 11:30 p.m., Dorothy Chen felt the same thrill that millions of Americans felt watching from home. She was in the presence of Johnny Carson, the man who'd been coming into her living room 5 nights a week for as long as she could remember, and for 90 minutes she would get to be part of that magic. 11 minutes into the taping, during a joke about the newly opened second Star Wars theater in Los Angeles, Dorothy Chen felt a sudden tightness in her chest. She later described it as feeling like someone had wrapped a steel band around her ribcage and was slowly tightening it, squeezing the air out of her lungs. She tried to take a breath and couldn't. She reached for her husband Michael's arm. He was sitting beside her in seat 12, but her hand wouldn't cooperate. The studio lights, which had seemed warm and exciting moments before, suddenly became unbearably bright. She heard Johnny Carson's voice from very far away, saying something about Wookiees, and then the sound cut out completely, and Dorothy Chen pitched forward out of her seat, hit the armrest in front of her, and collapsed onto the studio floor. The sound of Dorothy hitting the ground wasn't loud, but in the precise acoustic environment of a television studio designed to capture every nuance of sound, it was unmistakable. Johnny Carson stopped mid-sentence, the joke about Star Wars dying on his lips. The audience reaction was immediate and confused. Some people gasped. Some laughed nervously, thinking it might be part of the show. Some stood up to see what had happened. Michael Chen was already on his knees beside his wife, his voice cutting through the sudden chaos with a desperate cry that every microphone in the studio captured perfectly. "Dorothy, someone help! My wife needs help!" In the control room, Director Bobby Quinn's training kicked in immediately. Network protocol for any medical emergency during a live taping was absolute and non-negotiable. Cut to commercial, clear the studio, handle the situation off camera, resume taping when safe, or cancel the show entirely. Quinn reached for the button that would trigger the emergency commercial break, his hand moving with the automatic precision of someone who'd done this job for 20 years and knew that protecting the network from liability was always the first priority. But before his finger could hit that button, something unprecedented happened. Johnny Carson, standing center stage under the spotlight, took 3 steps forward to the edge of the stage, looked directly at Bobby Quinn through the control room glass, and said in a voice that was absolutely calm but carried complete authority, "Don't you dare cut! Keep rolling!" Then Carson did something that violated every rule of television production and personal safety. He jumped off the stage, not walked down the steps that led to the audience seating area, but actually jumped, a 4-foot drop from stage level to the studio floor, and ran toward row 4 where Dorothy Chen lay unconscious. Ed McMahon, without hesitation, followed him. Doc Severinsen put down his trumpet and moved toward the edge of the stage. In the control room, Bobby Quinn's hand hovered over the commercial button, while executive producer Freddie DeCordova's voice came through his headset. "Bobby, what the hell is Johnny doing? Cut to commercial right now." But Quinn didn't cut. Years later, he would explain his decision in an interview that wouldn't be published until after his death. "I saw something in Johnny's face that I'd never seen in 15 years of directing him. He wasn't performing. He wasn't being Johnny Carson, the television host. He was being whoever he was before he became Johnny Carson, and I realized that if I cut away from that moment, I'd be cutting away from the most real thing we'd ever captured." Carson reached Dorothy Chen within seconds, dropping to his knees beside her with a grace that suggested he'd done this before, though no one in the studio or control room could remember Johnny ever discussing medical training. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck, checking for a pulse, his face absolutely focused in a way that the audience had never seen. Michael Chen was still crying, his hands hovering over his wife's body, wanting to help but not knowing what to do. Carson looked at him and said, voice steady and clear, "Sir, I need you to stay calm. She's breathing. Her pulse is strong. We're going to take care of her." Then he looked up at the audience and said something that would be quoted in television textbooks for the next 50 years. "Everyone stay seated and stay quiet. This is not part of the show. This is a real medical emergency, and I need you to give us space and silence so we can help this woman." The studio audience, 300 people who'd come expecting entertainment and comedy, went absolutely silent. The kind of silence that never happens in a television studio, where there's always ambient noise, always someone coughing or whispering or shifting in their seat. But for the next 7 minutes, NBC Studio One in Burbank, California, achieved complete silence while Johnny Carson, Ed McMahon, and Doc Severinsen worked to help a woman they'd never met before and would likely never meet again. Carson kept his fingers on Dorothy's pulse, monitoring it, while Ed McMahon ran back to the production area to personally escort the on-site medical team to row 4. Doc Severinsen, who'd served as a Navy medic during the World War II, a fact that most people didn't know because Doc rarely discussed his military service, positioned himself at Dorothy's head and gently tilted it, back to ensure her airway was clear. In those 7 minutes before the NBC medical team arrived with their equipment and protocols, something remarkable happened that 20 million television viewers would never see. because the network made a decision that night to protect Dorothy Chen's privacy and their own liability exposure. The tape kept rolling in the control room. Bobby Quinn never did hit that commercial button. But what was captured in those 7 minutes was deemed too raw, too real, too far outside the boundaries of what The Tonight Show was supposed to be. The footage was logged, archived, and locked away where it would remain for 43 years until a documentary filmmaker doing research on Carson's career discovered its existence and fought a 3-year legal battle to have portions of it released. What that footage shows is Johnny Carson doing something that seems impossibly simple but was actually profoundly difficult: being present with another person's suffering without trying to fix it, joke about it, or turn it into entertainment. He stayed kneeling beside Dorothy Chen, his hand on her wrist monitoring her pulse, and he talked to her, even though she was unconscious. His voice, which millions of Americans knew from 15 years of monologues and interviews, was softer than anyone in that studio had ever heard it. He told Dorothy that she was going to be okay, that help was coming, that her husband was right there, and they weren't going anywhere. He asked Michael Chen questions about Dorothy: how long they'd been married, did she have any medical conditions he should know about, when had she last eaten, not because the answers would change anything, but because giving Michael something to focus on kept him from falling apart completely. Ed McMahon returned with the medical team at minute 4, and when the NBC physician tried to take over, Carson didn't immediately move. He waited until Dorothy's pulse and breathing were stable under the doctor's monitoring before he stood up. And even then, he didn't return to the stage. He stayed in the audience area, one hand on Michael Chen's shoulder, while the medical team worked. The audience remained silent. The cameras kept rolling. In the control room, network executives were having a meltdown about liability and protocols and what this was going to do to the taping schedule. But in Studio One, 300 people were witnessing something that felt more important than entertainment. They were watching someone famous remember how to be human. Dorothy Chen regained consciousness at minute 6. The first thing she saw when her eyes opened was Johnny Carson's face looking down at her with an expression of such genuine relief that several audience members would later say they started crying at that moment. Dorothy, confused and embarrassed, tried to sit up. Carson gently put his hand on her shoulder and said, "Take your time. You're safe. You're going to be fine." The medical team wanted to take her backstage to a private area for further evaluation, but before they moved her, Dorothy looked at Carson and said, voice shaking, "I'm so sorry I ruined your show." Carson's response, captured on the tape that would remain sealed for 43 years, was immediate and emphatic. "You didn't ruin anything. You reminded us what actually matters. Thank you for that." The medical team took Dorothy backstage on a stretcher. Diagnosis would later confirm she'd had a severe panic attack triggered by anxiety about being in the studio audience, combined with low blood sugar from not eating since breakfast because she was too nervous about the taping. And the studio was left with a decision about what to do next. Network protocol was clear: cancel the taping, send the audience home, reschedule. But Johnny Carson, still standing in the middle of the audience seating area, sweating through his suit from the adrenaline and exertion, made a different call. He walked back to the stage, climbed the steps this time rather than jumping, stood at his mark under the lights, and looked at the audience with an expression that wasn't the polished Johnny Carson smile, but something more vulnerable. He said, "We're going to take a 10-minute break. The network is going to tell you that you can leave if you want to, that you'll get a full refund for your tickets and an invitation to come back another time. But I'm asking you to stay, because I think we all just experienced something together that's worth acknowledging. And I'd like to try to do this show if you're willing to stay with me." The 10-minute break was chaos in the production areas. Freddie de Cordova was furious, arguing that they should cancel and start fresh the next day. NBC's legal department was having an emergency conference call about liability. The guests scheduled for the show, Angie Dickinson, George Carlin, Helen Reddy, were confused about whether they were still doing the taping. But in Studio One, something unexpected happened. Not a single audience member left. All 300 people stayed in their seats, waiting to see what would happen next, because they understood that they'd just witnessed something rare, and they wanted to see how Johnny Carson would handle the aftermath. When the taping resumed 12 minutes later, 2 minutes longer than the planned break because Carson insisted on going backstage to check on Dorothy Chen personally before returning to the stage, something fundamental had shifted in the energy of the room. The audience wasn't there to be entertained anymore. They were there to support someone they just watched be genuinely human in a crisis. Carson came back through the curtain. Ed McMahon didn't do the big introduction. Doc Severinsen didn't play the fanfare. Johnny just walked out, stood at his mark, and said, "Thank you for staying. I don't know exactly how to do this show right now, because what just happened wasn't part of any script I've ever read. But I think we should try, because that's what Dorothy would want. She came here to watch a show, and even though she can't be here right now, I'd like to do this for her." The rest of the taping was unlike any Tonight Show that had ever been produced. The monologue was abandoned. Carson didn't return to the Star Wars jokes or the Carter administration material. Instead, he talked directly to the audience about what they'd just experienced together. He wasn't funny. He wasn't trying to be funny. He talked about fear, about how fragile we all are, about how the illusion of control we maintain in our daily lives can shatter in an instant. He talked about his own anxiety, something he'd never discussed publicly before, and how there were nights when he stood backstage before walking through that curtain and felt like he couldn't breathe, couldn't remember why he was doing this, couldn't imagine facing another 90 minutes of having to be on. The audience listened in complete silence, and when Carson finally finished speaking, it had been almost 8 minutes of pure monologue without a single joke. The applause that followed wasn't the usual enthusiastic Tonight Show applause. It was something deeper, more personal, the sound of 300 people saying, "Thank you for being honest with us." The guests were brought out, but the interviews were different too. Angie Dickinson, who'd been scheduled to do a standard promotional chat about her new film, instead talked about a panic attack she'd had on a movie set in 1973 and how terrifying it was to lose control of your body in public. George Carlin, scheduled to perform 7 minutes of stand-up material, instead sat at the desk and had a conversation with Carson about mortality, about the fundamental strangeness of being alive, about how comedy was his way of dealing with the terror of existence. Helen Reddy sang, but before her performance, Carson asked her if she'd ever been afraid on stage, and she talked about her first major television appearance when she'd frozen completely and forgotten the lyrics to her own song. The show that resulted from that November 3rd taping was 90 minutes of television that had never been created before, and would never be created again. Raw, honest, vulnerable, and completely unlike anything The Tonight Show was supposed to be. NBC made the decision that night not to air the episode. The official reason given to the press was technical difficulties during taping, and the episode scheduled for November 3rd broadcast was replaced with a repeat from 2 weeks earlier. The audience members were asked to sign non-disclosure agreements, standard practice for any incident during a taping, and were given lifetime passes to The Tonight Show as compensation for their cooperation. The tapes of that evening were locked in the NBC archives with a note attached. Not for broadcast. Legal review required. Sensitive medical content. And there, they remained, largely forgotten, while Johnny Carson continued hosting The Tonight Show for another 15 years, retiring in 1992 without ever publicly discussing what happened on November 3rd, 1977. But the story didn't end with the network's decision to bury the footage. Dorothy Chen recovered fully from her panic attack and returned home to Pasadena, where she lived a quiet life as a librarian for another 32 years until her death in 2009. She never spoke publicly about what happened that night, honoring the non-disclosure agreement she'd signed, but she kept one memento that revealed the profound impact the evening had on her life. A handwritten note from Johnny Carson that arrived at her home 3 days after the incident. The note, which her husband Michael shared with a Carson biographer in 2012, was simple and direct. "Dear Dorothy, I wanted to check on you and make sure you're recovering well. What happened at the taping wasn't your fault, and I hope you won't let embarrassment keep you from enjoying television or live events in the future. You taught me something important that night about being present with people rather than performing for them, and I'm grateful to you for that lesson. If you ever want to come back to The Tonight Show, you have a standing invitation. Take care of yourself. Johnny Carson." Dorothy never took Carson up on the invitation to return to the show, but she did write him back, and that letter, also preserved in Michael Chen's personal papers, revealed something about the evening that the locked NBC footage couldn't capture. She wrote, "Mr. Carson, thank you for your kindness on what was the most humiliating night of my life. What I remember most isn't the panic attack or collapsing in front of 300 people and television cameras. What I remember is opening my eyes and seeing your face, and the look on your face wasn't pity or disgust or frustration that I'd interrupted your show. It was just concern for another human being. In that moment, you weren't Johnny Carson, the television star. You were just a person helping another person, and that's what gave me the courage to recover and move forward. Thank you for seeing me as a person rather than an interruption." The 300 audience members who witnessed what happened that night became an informal community, connected by the shared experience of seeing behind the curtain of television production and discovering something unexpected. In the early days of social media, several of them found each other online and created a private forum where they shared their memories of that evening. Their accounts, while differing in specific details, memory is unreliable, especially for traumatic events, all agreed on the essential truth. Johnny Carson stopped being a television host that night and became something more valuable. He became real. One audience member, Patricia Morrison, who was 19 years old at the time and sitting in row 7, posted a long reflection on that forum in 2008 that captured something essential about why the evening mattered. "I've watched thousands of hours of television in my life, and I can't remember most of it. The shows blur together, the jokes fade, the entertainment passes through you and leaves nothing behind. But I remember every detail of November 3rd, 1977, because it was the only time I've ever seen someone on television choose to be human instead of professional." Johnny Carson had every reason to let the medical team handle Dorothy and go back to doing his show. That's what his job was. That's what we paid for tickets to see. But instead, he made a different choice, and that choice taught me something about what we owe each other as human beings that no comedy routine ever could. The footage remained locked until 2020, when documentary filmmaker Sarah Dawson stumbled across a reference to it while researching Carson's early career. Dawson spent 3 years fighting NBC's legal department for access to the tapes, arguing that the historical significance outweighed the privacy concerns, especially since Dorothy Chen had passed away more than a decade earlier and her husband Michael had given written permission for the footage to be reviewed. NBC eventually agreed to let Dawson view the material under strict supervision, and what she saw there became the centerpiece of her documentary, The Real Johnny Carson, which premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in 2023. The documentary included approximately 4 minutes of footage from that November evening, not the full 7-minute sequence because the network still considered some of the medical details too sensitive for broadcast. But what was shown was enough to validate everything the audience members had been saying for 43 years. The footage showed Johnny Carson in a way the public had never seen him, unguarded, focused, genuinely present with another person's crisis. There was no performance, no attempt to manage the situation for the cameras, no concern for how this would play to an audience. Just a man kneeling beside a stranger, making sure she was safe, being human in the most fundamental way possible. The documentary also revealed something that even the audience members hadn't known. That night wasn't the first time Johnny Carson had dealt with a medical emergency. In 1968, during a taping that was similarly kept out of the broadcast archives, a stagehand had a heart attack backstage, and Carson, who'd received basic first aid training during his service in the Navy during World War II, had performed CPR until paramedics arrived. The stagehand survived, largely because of Carson's quick response, but the incident was never made public because the network's policy was to keep behind-the-scenes emergencies private. Carson never mentioned it in interviews, never used it as an example of his character or compassion, simply did what needed to be done and moved on. This pattern of quiet competence in crisis situations, Dawson's documentary suggested, was part of who Carson actually was when the cameras weren't supposed to be watching. Ed McMahon, in an interview recorded shortly before his death in 2009, told a story that didn't make it into most Carson biographies, but revealed something essential about his friend and colleague. Johnny had this thing about vulnerability. He couldn't stand to see people suffering alone. It went against something deep in his character. I saw him stop production more than once when someone, crew member, audience member, didn't matter, needed help. He'd just stop everything, deal with the person, make sure they were okay, and then go back to being Johnny Carson the entertainer. But those moments in between, when he was just being human, those were the real Johnny. That was the guy I knew for 30 years. The response to Dawson's documentary, particularly the footage of the Dorothy Chen incident, was overwhelming and unexpected. Viewers who'd grown up watching Carson, who'd seen him as the smooth professional who never broke character, discovered a depth and complexity they hadn't known existed. Social media filled with people sharing their own memories of Carson's humanity. The time he'd sent a personal check to a viewer who wrote about financial struggles. The time he'd called a young fan dying of cancer and spent an hour on the phone just talking. The countless small acts of kindness that Carson had never publicized because he didn't see them as newsworthy. The documentary revealed that Johnny Carson's greatest performance wasn't his comedy or his interviews or his perfect timing. It was the performance of being someone who didn't care deeply, when in fact he cared enormously and worked hard to hide it. The lesson of November 3, 1977, if there is one, isn't about Johnny Carson's heroism, or his medical training, or his ability to handle crisis situations. The lesson is simpler and more profound. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is stop performing and be present. Carson could have followed protocol that night. He could have let the medical team handle Dorothy while he returned to the stage and continued the show. He could have protected the illusion that entertainment is more important than reality, that the show must go on regardless of human need. But instead, he made a different choice, and that choice revealed something about his character that 40 years of perfect performances had hidden. Dorothy Chen's collapse wasn't a tragedy. She recovered fully and lived another 32 years. The footage being locked away wasn't a conspiracy. It was a network protecting privacy and limiting liability. The story isn't about uncovering scandalous secrets or revealing hidden darkness. It's about something much simpler and much rarer. A moment when someone famous remembered how to be ordinary in the best possible way. Johnny Carson, the man who'd mastered the art of controlled performance, who'd spent 15 years creating the illusion of effortless charm, stopped controlling the situation and simply responded as one human being to another human being in distress. In his final interview before his death in 2005, Carson was asked by Bob Costas about defining moments in his career. Carson mentioned the memorable guests, the huge ratings, the important cultural moments. But when Costas pressed him about personal moments that mattered to him, Carson hesitated before mentioning an incident he'd never discussed publicly, a night when someone in the audience needed help and he jumped off the stage to provide it. He didn't name Dorothy Chen. He didn't describe the details. He simply said, "That was the night I realized that being Johnny Carson, the television host, was my job, but being a decent human being was my responsibility. And when those two things came into conflict, The job could wait. 20 million viewers watched The Tonight Show on November 3, 1977, but they watched a repeat episode, unaware that something extraordinary had happened during the taping 6 hours earlier. 300 audience members witnessed what actually occurred, and for 43 years they carried that memory, telling their families and friends about the night Johnny Carson stopped being a television host and became simply a person helping another person. The footage was locked away, the incident buried under non-disclosure agreements and network protocols, but the truth had a way of surviving anyway, passed along through stories and memories until finally being validated by documentary footage that proved what those 300 people had been saying all along. That night, for 7 minutes, they saw the real Johnny Carson, and he was better than the performance had ever been.